Thanks for letting me join. I am part of the Carbon Leadership Forum Pennsylvania group working on embodied carbon advocacy, education, training across the Commonwealth. We're just a group of volunteers um, volunteering on behalf of Carbon Leadership Forum, previously based out of the University of Washington, and now is its separate nonprofit organization um, doing embodied carbon advocacy across the world. And Shibei is part of that group. That's how we connected. And I'm based in Pittsburgh. I was based in Erie for a few years, so I've kind of hopped around and was on AIA Pittsburgh's coat for a couple years. So I am familiar with the structure and the purpose of the committee. But I would say I feel like this is a lot more active than Pittsburgh's coat, but I haven't attended in a couple years. So I guess I can't say that for sure. I will just kind of talk through some information and feel free to stop me if you have any questions and also just, find me afterwards. We're a remote company, but a few of us are based in Pennsylvania. I guess I'll just share a little bit about WAP sustainability, and we're a um, sustainability consultant primarily for product manufacturers. And I'm writing over here, so I'm looking at the camera. Um, and we do a lot of sustainability consulting at the product level, material health. So think declare labels, HPDs, which is actually more of what I do than life cycle assessment or LCAs. And then we also support with carbon accounting and sustainability advisory at the company or corporate organizational level. And I'll talk a little bit about LCA software, just in the context of scaling LCAs, EPDs, moving into this world of PDF to digital EPDs and how that's all coming together. Um, and just so you know, we are part of now SLR Consulting, large sustainability consulting firm based out of the UK. And I think still learning more about it. They have typically been more traditional environmental consulting, so site remediation, water resources, that kind of work. And we're coming in as advisory support on corporate sustainability. Um, to give a introduction to product lifecycle assessment, as some of you may be working on whole building lifecycle assessment, and we work on product level environmental accounting methodology to measure the potential environmental impacts of a product from raw material extraction through end of life. Cradle to grave is sort of that terminology of understanding from extraction to end of life of a product. Um, to get some acronyms out of the way, LCA, assessment of these environmental impacts in accordance with ISO standards. Product category rule is essentially like a rule set for how do you do the life cycle assessment? What are the minimum requirements for data quality? What are some assumptions that people should generally make when you follow it for this specific product type? And that is, anything from um, steel products, ready mix concrete, flooring, resilient flooring, carpet tile, like each industry association that's helping develop a product category rule is giving you different rules to follow and different assumptions to make. And they may vary by global region you're working in. The EPD or Environmental Product Declaration is just the public facing output of that, summarizes the information from the LCA, makes it a little bit more general so the manufacturer doesn't disclose sort of confidential facility or manufacturing information. A program operator is like UL or SES that is managing the EPD program in one place where you can find a published EPD. So they kind of are, I guess, a project manager in some ways and a program manager as well. We're going to talk a little bit about global warming potential and other impact assessment uh, results and impact assessment data from an LCA. But just to put it in context, is that we'll hear a lot about embodied carbon or global warming potential and the associated environmental impacts from carbon of manufacturing a product. And it's just one of several um, impacts that can be estimated and calculated by doing the LCA. So um, it'll kind of get into a discussion later about decision making with these different impacts. Um, but it's just sort of putting it in context. There's different ways that we're assessing how the environment is impacted by a manufacturing process. Um, and so it's it's part of a holistic kind of assessment. But GWP measures the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing an increase in the absorption of radiation emitted by the Earth relative to carbon dioxide, usually over a specific time frame. And one of the things I was thinking about when pitching this to Shibei is that we're seeing so many different ways that GWP is reported on an EPD that it can be difficult to figure out what's the right one or what each one is trying to convey. And I think that it relates to the maturity of the life cycle assessment world, where once we've figured out how to, different robust ways to calculate and report this information, then it led to people wanting to know more information and more details about where the actual sources of the carbon related emissions or the carbon emissions are coming from. And so you might see things like GWP just by itself. You might see GWP total, which is often made up of global warming potential derived from fossil related sources, from biogenic sources, from land use and land use change sources. Um, Different standards and different programs handle biogenic carbon or bio-based carbon differently. How do we incorporate renewable energy certificates that manufacturers may be purchasing into how that affects the emissions associated with energy use at the facility? So there's a lot of different flavors of it, and um, that's just because it's providing more context to users. I think GWP total is probably just the way to go to kind of reduce that confusion, unless you have a very specific need to uh, consider a different GWP value that's reported, or you're working within a protocol like the GHG protocol that doesn't um, align with or doesn't facilitate the biogenic carbon calculations in there. So it's overall a reason of just providing more context to users as that world has developed a little bit further. The impacts are calculated and reported in different modules, and the manufacturer of a product is generally completing it based on the product category rule. Um, and A1 to A3 is what is thrown around as the definition of embodied carbon, because this is the emissions associated or the impacts associated with product manufacturing. So raw material supply, transportation of the raw materials to the manufacturing site, and the manufacturing process itself. Product manufacturers can and often report and calculate the other modules just based on the product category rule and what they would choose to include in their study. But sometimes the phases of use and end of life are so variable based on global region, or the use phase is not relevant for something like ready mixed concrete that's not actively consuming energy resources or resources in the use phase. So some product category rules don't require their manufacturers to calculate that, just because it's not a fruitful exercise for them. Um, and for manufacturers, that's the most control that they have, is the data quality and the manufacturing process and where their raw materials are coming from. So that's often why that's information that's pulled into like a whole building LCA is because that's the most representative of that manufacturing process. And then depending on where your project site is and where the manufacturing location is, that A4 distance of transporting materials to the project site is going to vary by where where your specific setup is. So that is something that should be calculated probably on the project team side. Another uh, variable that adds on to the number of GWP values you may see in a life cycle assessment or an environmental product declaration is just the methodology. And this is another way to group different impacts and report it in different ways, just because different global regions consider things differently. And I guess when we work on LCAs for customers and clients, we kind of assess where they tend to sell their products and apply the LCIA methodology that are relevant to where they sell into. So Tracy 2.1 is something you might see for North America. EN 15804 for the EU construction sector. There's a lot of these different ones, and we usually try to work within the different rule sets to say you're selling into these locations and they're probably going to prefer that the impacts be reported through this type of lens. Product category rules are, again, just the rule set to help conduct the LCA for a particular product category, provide general guidelines around scope, data quality, things like that. The EPD itself is the public communication of all of that work, and it's summarized into a format that is intended to be a little more user-friendly and provides a general overview of the process, the methodology, some of the assumptions, things like areas for further study and improvements. And they're usually externally third-party verified. I guess not always, but most of them are going to be, and you can find that information in the first or second page of the EPD. One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is product-specific versus industry-wide EPDs. And just from the perspective of manufacturers, why some of the manufacturers you're trying to ask data of may not have a product-specific EPD. It costs a lot to develop an environmental product declaration, and there's all these conversations about the quality of data and how much primary data we can get from the manufacturing process from suppliers, and what is the balance between data specificity and assumptions that can be made within the rules we're working within. So we always try to push for better quality data when we're making a product-specific EPD, just because if you're already making the investment, then you should be getting as much primary data as possible to best represent the scenario of this product manufacturing. But it's a cost per study for the manufacturer, especially if they're starting it not at scale, but maybe doing one product and then a second product and a third product. That there's some startup time invested in gathering data, setting up the infrastructure to create an LCA model. I think there's probably a lot of parallels in whole building LCAs. There's startup costs to get into the practice and kind of train people on how to use tools, how to kind of work within that system. But as soon as several people are able to work within that, then maybe that becomes more of a practice for a firm or for a group of people within a firm. And then for industry-wide EPDs, that's often when a trade association has kind of sponsored the development of an industry-wide EPD, and it invites participation from multiple manufacturers. And that lowers the startup costs and the investment for each company if they're participating in one. And it can also kind of be for them a way to influence, how their manufacturing or their data are better or different than some of their competitors. Um, but it's that's what it is. It's multiple manufacturers contributing data to a group project, and the average data across everyone can just really, that's maybe not skew, but it's not the same as a product specific EPD because it's just average data. Um, and I think we see a lot of companies and manufacturers who say that their trade association did the industry-wide EPD, but they weren't part of it. And we don't really suggest that they try to claim that they're part of it when they didn't contribute any data, and their process may be wholly different than what everyone else had put into that study. But I think when you're trying to either fill in gaps in the whole building LCA, or just try to put some data points into a study you may be doing, I think it could be used as a general benchmark, just with an understanding that it's probably not specific to the products that you're kind of trying to assess. Um, Take a breath and summarize. Um, PCRs provide the framework and guidelines for conducting the life cycle assessment, and the EPDs communicate the results of those assessments based on those rules. Um, I think that there's growing discussion around, um, especially those firms who are doing whole building LCA and kind of moving into this digital world. Well, I guess maybe it's been digital for a lot longer than some of this product LCA work has been, but um, what's the benefit, or what's the difficulty of kind of um, reading through a PDF and finding the specific carbon value or GWP value that you're looking for? How that takes a lot of time, especially if you are requesting EPDs from everything from all the companies that are trying to bid on the project or trying to get specified. And that's a lot of work on everyone's side, and PDFs have been the norm for a long time, and it's moving into a world of digital EPDs, whether that's digitizing a PDF EPD or just kind of publishing EPDs in a digital format to from the start. And I think that that's something that's on our minds right now, is how do we support a digital infrastructure and build in plugins and tools to the softwares and tools that architects, engineers, designers are using in a way that's meeting you where you need to be. If you're not trying to read through a 20, 50 page PDF to find the information that you're looking for, how do we get this information into a digital format? And how do we make sure that that digital data gets plugged into your tools in the right way? And I could not tell you how that's working, but I know that it's happening by the software people in the world. And then in the meantime, you can find the manufacturer product EPDs based on who the program operator is. So if you go to UL Spot, if you work with SES on things, they host EPDs there. Many of you may be familiar with EC3 and that aggregator database of compiling multiple EPDs from manufacturers, and other sort of similar databases that are pulling across to program operators, putting them all into one place in one area for you to look through and to pick from, or to find data from, and then manufacturer websites as well. This was from a slide presentation that my team gave earlier this week. It's just generally about how we're seeing there's this balance between the there's the usual workflow of doing EPDs in a very singular mode of, we're gathering the best data and we're kind of trying to build the best quality assessment and represent the manufacturer's manufacturing process in the most accurate or sort of representative way. And then you have all these tools that are proposing to create LCAs in 5 minutes, create one LCA a day, create 1,000 LCAs in a month. Like there's all these different ways of how that's scaling up. Um, and in the webinar that was happened earlier this week, that just kind of touched on the part of like when we're developing lifecycle assessments, are we trying to make them faster for users? Are we trying to leverage AI in some of this calculation and assessment work? Are we trying to kind of keep costs as low as possible? So there's all these questions about how LCA and EPDs are growing um, and becoming more popular in this digital world. And maybe there's this consideration of greater access to environmental data from manufacturers, but who has the time to really pick into how reliable that data are? How is the study done? How do I figure out if that's something that I should be using in my whole building LCA? How do I make note of what the trade-offs I'm considering in data quality or data access? And I don't know how to answer all those questions. I'm just I would like to figure them out with you, and maybe we can have a discussion about that. But I just wanted to kind of bring this up that suddenly it can feel like there were no there was a lot of requests for manufacturers to produce EPDs, and now maybe you're becoming inundated with EPDs, and it's like, well, what am I supposed to do with? I went from trying to ask for data, and now there's so much data that I don't know how to sort through it and what to do with it. But it also just allows for some of that, the multiple reporting of the GWP values that we talked about, to be facilitated by a digital infrastructure where you maybe had to read through the multiple pages of the EPD to find GWP fossil based or GWP biogenic, and now digital EPDs and digital infrastructure can already kind of generate the platform for that and report all the information, and that kind of assists with the use case of it. And then I think this was the last sort of discussion slide that I had. Is just going back to where we're able to use this information to make decisions on reducing embodied carbon in projects, and how does that fit into other goals that you as a project team may have or as a specifier may have. There's the data that lives within the LCA results themselves. So how does a lower GWP product, how does that impact maybe acidification potential, eutrophication potential? There's one decision there, and then there's also just the realities of making decisions in projects, whether it's value engineering or budget or location or scheduling. That I yeah, that's on your side. And I think I'm kind of just want to have a discussion about that, or we're not going to solve it today, but want to keep that conversation going. And this is just kind of hopefully giving a little more information about where the data is coming from the manufacturer side.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thanks, Rob. Paul, you have a question for Alex?
Sure. Hey, thanks, Alex. This is it's really interesting and reminding me about the problem that you all have is that we all have is that there's just so much fire hose of information, sorting through it to find what is useful and what is just noise is difficult. Laura and I have a small firm, and we don't necessarily need all this information for the certain kind of certification, the passive house certifications. That's the world that we live in generally. And so this is all great information, but mostly I care about it as more as a best practice. how do I compare the kind of insulation I'm looking at from a carbon, embodied carbon impact? I know that I want to reduce steel, concrete, and glass. And so maybe that's good enough for me, but I know that there's this other information that, the building envelope, the insulation is a big part of it and actually has a lot of weight that adds to the building. So I guess I'm not sure if this is a comment or a request, or I think it's an observation, is that it seems like I would love it if AI or something could create its own database for people, like a specific database. Like I don't need all the other stuff. I want to know what is the GWP for all the types of materials that I particularly specify. Do you think that that's something that's going to come in the future? Is it here now and I just don't know about it? Or is that information that just isn't developed? And I think a lot of it's because I don't have Herman Miller doing EPDs of specific products. I care about assemblies, and I think it's a much more complicated embodied carbon calculation than counting chairs, for example.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a few tools like EC3. I think you can filter maybe by product type, maybe by CSI division, and compare that way. And then I think it's if it's there's purely sort of like the number assessment of I can compare embodied carbon and then choose the lowest embodied carbon um, from that data that I have. And it's usually best to just try to, yeah, maybe there's a tool that has to compare and see, are they using the same rules? Are they using the same guidelines? Because that's the best comparison that can be made. Um, I I don't know, it's if they're using different product category rules and different rule sets, it's not recommended to make that comparison in that way. So, but that's a lot of work on someone to kind of check all those boxes. Like, can I compare these? And maybe there's a tool out there, and I just need to think a little bit harder on that. Um, but I think that there's sort of like manual kind of ways to get there. Of like, let me open this tool and filter by this product type, and then sort the values and compare the values, and then hopefully they are using the same rules, and that makes them comparable in that way, and then maybe I can make my decision off of that. But I hear the need to have some kind of aid in assessing some of those I guess minimum parameters or minimum requirements to say, yeah, this is a fair comparison and fair um, assessment that I'm making here, and that I can feel some confidence in how that decision and that comparison is being made.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Question in the chat. Who asked, what is eutrophication?
Eutrophication potential. Let me find the capacity of nutrients to cause over fertilization in water and soil. So algal blooms, kind of stemming from over nutrients concentration in water sources and soil.
I wish Jonathan is on. Maybe he can tell us more about water. Rob had a question about Green Badger. What is it? And it was a good tool. Rob, are you on?
I'm
Trying
here.
to say something. Oh, okay. Hi.
Yeah, I'm here. We're piloting the use of a product called Green Badger, which is a to use their words, a comprehensive database of all materials that might feed into a lead submission process. And I'm finding it to be pretty decent. And it may answer some of Paul's questions. I'm curious for you, I didn't see it mentioned in your presentation. Is this something that y'all have looked at, evaluated, had feelings about? Curious what an expert like you might think. And if you don't want to answer for political reasons, you can say, I don't want to answer for political reasons, and I'll understand.
I don't know too much about Green Badger itself. I don't. I'd have to talk to other people on my team about different sort of aggregator tools, and especially in how they, I guess, facilitate the submission process into maybe like the GBCI portal or other portals like that. But yeah.
No, and I'll just say for folks that aren't familiar with the product, it does theoretically submit for lead, and it does collect and draw EPDs automatically and checks them with AI for their relevant dates. Because that's what we're finding is that the EPDs, we collect them and then they're out of date. And we don't have a comprehensive tool to make sure that the EPDs we're putting in are good. And then the last thing I'll say about Green Badger, I don't own stock in it, but the idea that we use it and then turn it over to the builder for continuity on material selection and specifications is answering an important question where, Alex, we do all this work to specify the right materials, and then halfway through the construction process, the submittals come in and the builders aren't using the products that we're submitting, and then we have to go back and fight. So that, I guess that's a flag for you in the industry of a thing that we're really struggling with right now. I believe that's the one, Shabay, greenbadger.com. Again, I own no stock in it. We're piloting it on 2 projects. I don't know if it's any good yet, but it certainly has been helpful so far. All right.